Hey, this is Keenan, and today I'm talking about transgression, death, and sexuality in Left-Hand Path Tantra. This image on the screen here is a representation of the goddess Kali, whose name means black or time in Sanskrit. And like all goddesses in Hinduism, Kali is a manifestation of Shakti, which is the universal life force, or this primordial energy that creates, preserves, and destroys all universes as an expansion of the divine power. So the universe is the divine energy in its manifest form, whereas the primordial energy is unmanifest. And Kali is specifically the aspect of Shakti that is in the destructive phase. So when we die or when things are destroyed, some aspect of their life force is reabsorbed back into the universal essence. And then that energy can be recycled, it can be reborn into a different form. So Kali has a sword in her upper left hand in this particular image, and that is the sword of jnana, which is discerning insight. So it's this, aspect of reality and of the individual mind that discerns between different things. So it's called buddhi in Sanskrit, this faculty of discernment, or this discriminating intelligence that helps us to make wise decisions when it's functioning properly. This is the same word that Buddha comes from. It means your awareness, but specifically discerning awareness. And, it could also be translated as conscience. So, what helps us to decide between what's right and what's wrong, in a simplified moralistic framework, or, what is going to help us in the long term versus what is going to harm us in the long term. And through different yogic and tantric practices, we can develop and cultivate this faculty of discernment, this buddhi, so that we can discern the universal consciousness and energy and bliss within our microcosmic being. Beyond the different layers of our mortal egoic self, there's this macrocosmic essence that is at the core of it. So Kali uses this sort of jnana to sever the head. She's holding a severed head in her lower left hand in this particular image, and that represents the ego, or the mortal individual identity. And through this yogic process of discerning universal consciousness within ourselves, we can transcend our mortal identity and become more aligned with the innate omniscience and omnipotence of consciousness. So she is standing on top of Shiva, who's her consort or her husband. And so Shiva represents universal consciousness, whereas the different goddesses are aspects of universal energy. So consciousness is more like this stable, passive awareness, whereas the energy is this dynamic, active life force. So there's this polarity to them, but they're not separate from each other ultimately. And a lot of representations, Kali is sitting on top of Shiva and straddling him in sexual embrace. And that represents, the fact that universal consciousness and the universal energy are ultimately inseparable from each other, but we represent different aspects of that one core essence with these different mythological figures so that we can attune ourselves to that particular current of the divine. And, Kali and Shiva are both deities of death and destruction, so their particular current, their particular energy, or the way that the divine manifests through these mythological forms is more related to the destruction of limitation. Whereas, another goddess like Lakshmi, who's the goddess of abundance and wealth and preservation, is more embodied a lot of times. She's more down to earth, and she's more of like an earth mother type deity, whereas Kali is this, ferocious, devouring, destructive aspect of nature that goes beyond limited forms to the essence. And she has a skirt of severed arms, which represents karmas, or these subconscious karmic seeds that we generate through our actions and experiences. And through this process of spiritual discernment, we can remove our identification with the outcome of our actions, so we can be liberated from karmic repercussions for our actions. And we perform most of our actions with our hands. So she has a skirt of both right and left arms, right hands and left-handed arms, that she wears, that represent auspicious and transgressive actions. So she can remove the karma for both our beneficial and our harmful actions, basically. And then her garland of severed heads. I don't know exactly how many heads are in this particular image, but a lot of times she's shown with 50 severed heads around her neck, which represents the 50 phonemes or sounds in the Sanskrit syllabary, which is like an alphabet, but it's the sounds of the alphabet rather than the letters of the alphabet. And those Sanskrit phonemes are different aspects of the vibratory power that creates, preserves, and destroys all universes. So she transcends that vibratory power that speaks the universe into existence and helps us to connect with the primordial silence that is beyond all manifestation. So let's recap the last video, which was, touching on the right-hand path and the left-hand path in Tantra. So the right-hand path, or Dakshinachara, is very much emphasizing purification and, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes submission to an external deity, whereas the left-hand path is focusing more on transgression and self-deification. And, there's a lot of overlap between the two paths in Hindu Tantra. So, even on the left-hand path, we might be working with a deity that we perceive as external, but we come to a realization at some point that we are a microcosm of the entire universe. So that external deity exists within ourselves as part of our core essence as well. And in Hindu philosophy, there's a teaching that there are 3 gunas, or threads, that are woven throughout nature. So, another, Tantra, the word Tantra has a lot of different meanings in Sanskrit. So one is, an esoteric system of spiritual practice, which is, the way we're using it for the most part in this context. But it can also mean a book or a doctrine, and it can mean a loom for weaving. So there's a lot of symbolism that has to do with weaving with Tantra. And the word guna means a thread, or it can mean a quality or an attribute. And in Hindu philosophy, the 3 attributes that universal consciousness uses to weave the natural world together are sattva, which is purity or clarity, and rajas, which is passion or stimulation, and tamas, which is darkness or inertia. And, it's not really a good, bad type deal. They're all part of the divine. All 3 gunas are part of the divine. And Shiva and Shakti, in their primordial aspect as universal consciousness or as universal energy, are gunatita, which means that they are beyond the gunas, they're beyond the qualities of nature. So they transcend and encompass all 3 of these threads. Purity, passion, and darkness are all manifestations of this divine oneness, basically. But on the right-hand path, there's a lot of emphasis on purification, which cultivates sattva. So, there's a strict moral code that helps us to become more pure in our body and more pure in our mind, and that helps us to, have this very clear mind and a sense of peace and wholeness and bliss, and it sharpens our discernment so that we can make conscientious, wise decisions. And that's very helpful to a certain degree, But a lot of right-handed religions tend many times to overemphasize purity, where it becomes like this obsessive compulsion to purify all the time, and things that are seen as impure become evil and taboo, and this leads to a lot of psychological repression, and a whole bunch of issues can come out of this, where people just become really psychologically unwell, even if they're very pure, because they're not integrating these shadow aspects of their identity in a healthy way. So, in contrast to the right hand path, the left hand path of Tantra teaches transgression, which, in the context of Tantra, means using tamas and rajas, darkness and passion, in an alchemical process. So, what we want is to go very deeply into the darkness on the left-hand path, and then to use this passionate energy of rajas to help us to transmute the darkness into light, into sattva, so that we can discern the underlying essence of our being and align ourselves with our innate omniscience and omnipotence. What is the purpose of transgression on the left-hand path? Well, in order to really understand transgression in Tantra, you have to understand karma. So there's this word in Sanskrit, samskara, which is an ingrained subconscious karmic pattern that creates our reality. So there's this idea that we have three bodies: a physical body, a subtle body, which is mind and energy, and a causal body, which is the subconscious, basically, in Western psychological terms. And the subconscious is a storehouse of memories or karmic seeds from our past actions and experiences. And the more we have certain kinds of experiences, or the more intense those experiences are, and the more we repeat the same kinds of actions over and over, there starts to become a karmic pattern that gets worn into our causal body. So it's like we're wearing a groove into our subconscious, and that groove, or that habit, or that collection of memories conditions the way that we experience our reality and that we act in the world. And even more than that, there's this idea that waking reality is a collective dream. So much like how when we have dreams when we're sleeping, and we experience these projections of our individual subconscious in these really realistic dream experiences, the waking state is a collective projection of everybody's subconscious karma. So while Shiva and Shakti in their primordial aspect are beyond all polarities like hot and cold, light and dark, pleasure and suffering, male and female, etc., they express their divine essence through polarities. So the world, the natural world, is constantly shifting back and forth. It's pulsating between different polarities. Like, there's summer, fall, winter, spring, and summer again. So there's a cycle, and we inhale and we exhale, and we're breathing, and our heart contracts and expands to pump blood. So there's all these vibrations throughout nature that is basically the pulsation of the Godhead, basically, on many different levels. And the different polarities of that pulsation, like hot in the summer and cold in the winter, or light at noon and dark at midnight, are, they're both manifestations of this divine bliss that transcends all polarities. So in order to reconnect ourselves with that divine, omniscient, and omnipotent bliss, we have to go beyond our own individual polarization. So when we have these subconscious karmic patterns, part of it's our own actions, part of it's how we've been conditioned by the culture and the people around us. And those karmic patterns have a particular polarity to them. So, for example, if somebody has been conditioned to view sex as really dirty and morally reprehensible, then they'll have a sanskara that is very polarized against sexuality and healthy human sexual interactions. It's averse to those kinds of experiences. So when we have an experience that has a polarity that's opposite to that samskara, that experience can help to negate our subconscious conditioning. And when we become less and less identified with these karmic patterns in the subconscious, we can become more and more identified with our innate omniscience and omnipotence. And this all is related to tantric alchemy as well. Transmuting one thing to its opposite, basically. So in Western medieval alchemy, there were a lot of people trying to transmute base metals into gold, like turning lead into gold, or they were trying to find a philosopher's stone to become immortal. And similar kinds of things are done in tantric alchemy as well. And there's an internal alchemy and there's an external alchemy. And so I'm not personally trained in external alchemy, but from the reports that I've heard from people I know about external alchemy, Indian alchemists were way more successful at achieving really impressive feats through alchemy than Western alchemists were. So, for example, a lot of Western alchemists made different concoctions using mercury because mercury is seen as like a sacred metal, and they thought it was related to the philosopher's stone, so they would make these different concoctions in order to try to become immortal through ingesting mercury. But mercury is very toxic and can cause all kinds of mental and physical health issues. But in tantric alchemy, I don't know all the details, but from what I understand, there are alchemical processes for working with mercury. And mercury is seen as Shiva's semen, whereas sulfur is seen as Shakti's menses. And so basically there are these forms of external alchemy where mercury is fused with sulfur to create mercury sulfide, and then they put mercury sulfide through this long alchemical process that lasts days or weeks. And through that alchemical process, the mercury becomes non-toxic, so it can pass through somebody's system and have these medicinal benefits without causing this this poison effect that normal mercury has. But if you are interested in that, there are people who can make that, but you have to be really, really sure that it's somebody who knows what they're doing, because if somebody tries to make it but they make it incorrectly, it's still toxic. But I did see a scientific study that they did on rats with one of these alchemical medicines made from mercury, and what they showed was that after exposing the rats to this mercury and feeding it to them for I forget how long it was, but it was like several weeks or whatever, there was no toxicity observable in the rats at all, which is really, really impressive. So likewise, there's an internal alchemy that's about fusing these different aspects of ourself, where mercury represents the mind and sulfur represents the soul or the consciousness. So we want to bind the soul or bind the mind to our consciousness basically through meditation, and that can help us to ingest or to go through really dark tamasic experiences without being corrupted by them, basically. And tantric yoga uses the body and tools like mantras and breathing techniques and different ritual practices that sublimate our subconscious instinctual energies. In other words, to awaken Kundalini. So like how external alchemy is trying to turn base metals into gold, this internal alchemy is trying to turn the base metal of our animal instincts into the gold of enlightenment, basically. And within the subtle body, the body of energy and mind, there are these different energy centers called chakras that are related to these different aspects of our consciousness. And the lower chakras, the chakras that are, in the abdomen and the pelvis, govern instinctual energies that are related to self-preservation, sexuality, sleep, and hunger. And through these tantric yogic practices, we can awaken these, these subconscious energies and transform them. We can cause them to ascend through the subtle body up into the chest and into the head. And in this process of transforming the energies and circulating the vital life force from the lower chakras up into the higher chakras, and then maybe even going back down, we can transform these instinctual energies to expand our consciousness and empower our wisdom and autonomy. So it's like this core life force that is self-identifying with the body and the mind keeps us alive, and it the instincts for like self-preservation and sex and sleep and hunger are very important for helping us to exist in an embodied state. But at a certain point, there are a lot of dysfunctional aspects that can come out of these instincts when they're not being when their energies aren't being circulated and refined in an effective manner. For example, like if this self-preservation instinct, it's like survival and fending off potential harm to keep yourself from dying, and that's very important to keep you alive. But then when people have anxiety disorders, just as an example, then or phobias, then they start to have this dysfunctional activation of the self-preservation instinct, where they're anxious about things that they don't need to be anxious about. Like, maybe somebody has a phobia of public speaking, just as an example, and, there's no actual physical threat from speaking in public. But if somebody gets really anxious, that means that their self-preservation instinct is getting activated by the situation. And, Tantra can help us with that in order to like use this instinctual energy in a beneficial way to help us to feel grounded and connected to our core essence and whole and complete. And then, if we work with our issues, like our phobias or anxiety disorders, or addictions is another one, where addictions are like we have this subconscious instinct, like we feel like we need to get high to feel like we're safe, or in order to survive. We feel like it's like a survival type deal where we have to get high, and that's a dysfunctional manifestation of our subconscious instincts. But through these tantric practices, we can transform the way that instinctual energy is being expressed. So we can redirect the energy that's being projected onto a substance or onto a sexual partner, or onto whatever, and instead we can project it onto a deity and transform the energy within ourselves in order to begin to awaken the innate omniscience and omnipotence of that deity within ourselves. So there are two main forms of transgression that I'm going to talk about in this particular presentation. One is mortuary transgression, the other is sexual transgression, although there are also other forms of tantric transgression, one being the use of intoxicants in a ritual context in order to facilitate a more intense experience of union with divinity, basically. But we'll talk about that at another time, perhaps. But mortuary transgression is, transgression involving death and darkness, basically. So there are a lot of left-handed tantric lineages that evolved or started in the cremation grounds, which are the places in Indian culture where they burn dead bodies. Oftentimes, it's on a river or next to the ocean, so they can dispose of the ashes into the water. But basically, it's where people go to have funerals. And so people who can't afford to be cremated will sometimes have their corpses left in the cremation grounds. And, there's a lot of demons and ghosts who like the death energy a lot, who live in cremation grounds. And, in Orthodox Hindu society, all of these things, cremation grounds, corpses, demons, and ghosts are seen as very tamasic, as very dark and impure. But in Left-Hand Path Tantra, the tantrika is expected to overcome the fear of death and to sublimate the self-preservation instinct. So, it's like this fear of death and the self-preservation instinct. It's, the instinct related to the Muladhara chakra, the root chakra at the base of the pelvis, the perineum. And that's like our most deeply rooted instinct, for good reason, because, if we don't have the self-preservation instinct, then we don't know not to jump off a cliff, or we don't know not to do something that's going to potentially kill us. But, this fear of death is also related to this like clinging to the body, to our mortal individual ego as well. So we go through this this process of facing our fears and overcoming our fears, which awakens this self-preservation instinct. And that self-preservation instinct, that fear, can either drive people crazy or it can sharpen their awareness and their instincts. So, for example, after 9/11 happened, people were really scared, and, it was a very scary time in the US. And a lot of people reacted to that fear by going out and, attacking people who looked Arab, or, doing things like that are very ignorant and shallow and really unhelpful. But they're like driven to this frenzied state by their fear because they don't know how to handle it in a productive, beneficial way. But if we've mastered our energy body and we've regulated our nervous system, then really the purpose of this fear is to sharpen our instincts so that we can survive more effectively in a life-threatening situation. And it's like this adrenaline rush that enables a mother to pull a bus off of her child in really extreme circumstances that she would, it's something she would never be able to do normally. But the fear and the instinctual reaction and the surge of adrenaline gives her this immense strength that can move mountains, basically. And this is the kind of response, this this enhancement of our personal power that we're really going for with Tantra, rather than this dysfunctional misreaction to fear. So self-realization involves going through a spiritual death and rebirth process. And that's one of the aspects of like working with Kali, or overcoming the fear of death, is to die while we're still alive and to experience this ego death where our mortal individual identity dissolves into the universal consciousness and energy and bliss, and is fully immersed in that omniscient and omnipotent essence of reality. And then we can be reborn back into our individual self but with more access to that innate omniscience and omnipotence. So, there are a lot of videos and whatnot of agoris who are a certain tantric left-handed tradition who live in the cremation grounds, and they have to live there for like 12 years a lot of times, and they live among the dead and they perform rituals on corpses and all this kind of stuff. And that's a very intense ascetic path, and it's valid for people who are called to it, but it's also very impractical for a lot of people, especially living in the US, to have to move to India to go live in a cremation ground in a different culture where they don't know the language, and to leave their jobs and families in order to go do this. It's just impractical for most people that I've met. So what I practice is more closely related to Kaula Tantra, which is kind of an offshoot of the agoris. Like they have a similar history, but the agoris went in more of an aesthetic direction, and the Kaulikas went in more of a householder direction. They went into a direction that was more suitable for people with families and jobs and who live in the world and who don't necessarily have the time to go sit in the cremation ground all day and all night. So in Kaula Tantra, it's this more internalized form of left-handed transgression where the body is the cremation ground. The body is our temple, the body is our cremation ground. And through working with the body, through contemplating the impermanence of the body, then we can overcome our attachment to the body and become more aligned with the innate omniscience and omnipotence of consciousness. So the other form of transgression that I'll be talking about today is sexual transgression. Sexual energy is rajasic. It's very passionate and stimulating and transformative, and it's closely linked to Kundalini. So the core life force, the second chakra after the Muladhara chakra, governs our sexual and creative energy. So there's this internal alchemy that we can do through various practices that are included in my book and video course, The Left-Hand Path of Tantra, where we can channel sexual stimulation to sublimate rajas and tamas into blissful sattva. So by working with, dark elements or sacraments like meat and intoxicants and things like this, and by working with this very passionate sexual energy in this process of internal alchemy, we can transmute the tamas and the rajas into this clarity and bliss and wholeness of sattva, and that sattva helps us to more easily discern our core essence, which is omniscience and omnipotence. So people of all genders and orientations can learn to master their sexual energy for maximum enjoyment and liberating power. So working with these tantric sexual techniques, pretty much across the board from what I've seen, helps people to have more fulfilling sexual experiences. And if it's being used for spiritual development and cultivating magical power, it's very effective at that as well. And so another thing that happens when we start working with sexual alchemy is it can help us to counteract sexual repression and facilitate sexual healing. So, a lot of people, maybe even a majority of people, have some form of sexual trauma by the time they reach adulthood, or even during adulthood it can happen, where, people get raped or they get molested or they get cheated on. There's all different kinds of things that people get wounded by sexually. And by working with this this subconscious energy, we can awaken those traumatic patterns in a safe environment so that we can digest and process that experience more completely, so that we can heal from the experience and feel more whole and complete. It's working through this subconscious karmic pattern in a beneficial way, where if it's in the context of you're working through it on your own, or with a therapist that you trust, or with a partner who respects you and who there's a mutual consent and trust in that relationship, then working through these psychic wounds from our past traumas is something that very frequently happens through beginning to work with sexual alchemy. So it can be scary at first, and it can be painful to have these old wounds come up, but if it's done in a respectful, skillful manner, then ultimately working through those issues is going to help you, on many different levels in your relationships and your own sense of psychological well-being. So I very deeply believe in the importance of working with sexual energy in a healthy, consensual context in order to expand our potential and heal ourselves. So in order to really go a little bit deeper into the what and why of tantric sexuality, we have to understand ojas, which could be translated as the sap of life. So a more widely known Sanskrit word in English is prana, which is the life force. It's like Kundalini is excuse me, Kundalini is the core life force, so it's a very concentrated form of prana. But there's prana throughout the entire body, and we have a pranic field or an aura around our body, and that's what animates us and keeps us alive. It's very closely related to the breath. So we get most of our prana through the breath. We also get it from food and from sunlight and things like that. But most of it comes from inhaling and exhaling. And so there's a physical breath and physical oxygen that enters our physical body. But then there's a subtle counterpart to the breath, which is prana. This subtle life force, which is, it's kind of the same as the breath, but it's also kind of different from the breath, the physical breath. So ojas is like prana in that it's the subtle counterpart of a physical aspect of the body. So where prana is the energetic counterpart to the breath, ojas is the subtle counterpart to semen in males and menses in women. And it's this spiritual energy that promotes emotional well-being. It helps us to feel more loving and compassionate, and to empathize with others, and to feel whole and complete and integrated. And it can act as a spiritual fuel. So it's like this spiritual glue that we can cultivate in disciplined sadhana or spiritual practices that go on for weeks or months. And it basically acts as a bond, a glue between the individual consciousness and a deity who is this, omniscient and omnipotent aspect of reality, so that the individual identity can become infused with that omniscience and omnipotence to a greater degree. But when men ejaculate and they expel their semen, a lot of that ojas is being expelled along with the semen. And it's similar to when women menstruate, then they're releasing ojas. They're also cleansing themselves, but they're releasing a lot of ojas as they cleanse their bodies of toxins and whatnot through this menstrual fluid that carries unused eggs. So it's like this creative energy gets drained out along with all the toxins. But males in tantric sexual alchemy can train their body to have non-ejaculatory orgasms, which preserves ojas and helps us to expand consciousness. And we can also repurpose that ojas for magical purposes and other things like that. And women can also actually train their bodies not to menstruate, but that is potentially dangerous. There are some yoginis, female yogis who are renunciates or like nuns, basically, who will stop their menstruation, but they're doing that in a particular context where they have a qualified teacher with them who can help them work through things, and they're very strict about purifying themselves in other ways. So basically, when working with your average Joe or your average Jane with sexual alchemy, men are encouraged to limit their ejaculation to once a month, so they can still have sex and masturbate or whatever. If they master having non-ejaculatory orgasms, and they can still conserve their ojas while having sex. But as if they limit their actual ejaculation to once a month or so, then they're at about the same frequency of losing ojas as a female, and that helps to maintain their spiritual and psychological health. And during periods of sadhana, you might even go longer than a month without ejaculating. But it takes a lot of practice and training in order to master these techniques, which are explained in detail in my book, in my video course. And so both males and females can become multi-orgasmic, and they can cultivate ojas through love and intimacy by mastering the sexual alchemy. And it's there are a number of techniques that we use to become multi-orgasmic or to master non-ejaculatory orgasms. And these techniques will help us to become more relaxed and at ease in sexual encounters, and to regulate the nervous system, and to work with our energy. But it's a lot to learn all at once, basically. So it takes weeks and months of practice and training. So in most cases, sexual alchemy is best practiced alone before you proceed to consensual partner practices. So it's helpful to learn how to do this with your own body before you begin trying to do it with a partner, one or more partners, because when other people start getting involved, it becomes a lot more difficult, and there are a lot of ways that you can get distracted. So it's usually best to practice these sexual techniques on one's own, and then once you've gained some mastery over the techniques, then to proceed to consensual partner practices. So as far as I'm concerned, as long as everybody involved in a particular sexual encounter is consenting and informed of any relevant information that about the people they're consenting with, then that's perfectly legitimate and fine. And breaking taboos, like if somebody is homosexual and they've been conditioned not to be the way they are, then that kind of transgression can be really powerful for people. From what I've heard, I'm primarily attracted to women. I've had a handful of sexual encounters with males, but they're not really what I'm genuinely attracted to. And it was transgressive for me to do that, but it's not really what I'm interested in particularly. But for people who really are attracted to people of the same sex or the same gender or whatever, then that kind of transgression especially when it's combined with sexual alchemy, can be extremely liberating for people.